On May 19th, 1999, Lucasfilm and 20th Century Fox released the first new Star Wars film into theaters since 1983's Return of the Jedi. This new film followed the early life of Anakin Skywalker, a young boy born into slavery on a desert planet named Tatooine. Now, at this point in his life, Anakin is an 8-year-old kid. He's full of dreams despite the squalor in which he lives. He loves stories of Jedi, the protectors of good in the galaxy. He's extremely good at fixing things, and he uses those skills to build droids and create his own pod racer, which he is equally adept at piloting. And so when two Jedi cross his path during the events of this movie, one would think that his story is destined for good and wonderful things. But unfortunately, we know it's not. And if you went into theaters in 1999, you would have known that before the movie even started. There wasn't a big secret to keep, after all. And if you look at some of the posters that adorned hallways of theaters before opening day, you would see that his future was already well known. In this poster, for example, you see a young Anakin, but his shadow foretells where his story is headed, because that shadow tells us he will become that infamous villain from the first 3 movies, Darth Vader. Now, those first 3 movies from 1977, 1980, and 1983, they tell the story of Anakin's later years as Darth Vader. He's a twisted, wretched, hateful villain. He's directly responsible for the deaths of countless people. If you were at all familiar with those earlier movies, you would immediately know that this young kid, full of hope, full of love for his mother, powerfully skilled, and with a desire to help whoever he can, his story doesn't end up like you hope it would. Why even tell this story? We know how it ends. It's not the happiest story. It's full of pain. It's full of despair. Even though Anakin does later defeat that darkness inside himself and he rids himself of that Darth Vader moniker, he still ends up dying. So why go back to this part of Anakin's story? Why release this movie 16 years after we already know what happened to him? What's the point? Now maybe you're already starting to see what I'm driving at here. We have a similar question to answer this week. Today is known as Christ the King Sunday. It's the last Sunday of what is known as ordinary time, and it's the last Sunday in the Christian year. We are at the end. And being that we are at the end of the liturgical calendar, our gospel reading for today is also sort of an ending. Let's read together Luke 23, 33 to 43. When they came to the place called the Skull, they crucified him there, along with the criminals, one on his right, the other on his left. Jesus said, "Father, forgive them, for they do not know what they are doing." And they divided up his clothes by casting lots. The people stood watching, and the rulers even sneered at him. They said, "He saved others. Let him save himself if he is God's Messiah, the chosen one." The soldiers also came up and mocked him. They offered him wine and vinegar and said, "If you are the king of the Jews, save yourself." There was a written notice above him which read, "This is the King of the Jews." One of the criminals who hung there hurled insults at him. "Aren't you the Messiah? Save yourself and us." But the other criminal rebuked him. "Don't you fear God," he said, "since you are under the same sentence? We are punished justly, for we are getting what our deeds deserve. But this man has done nothing wrong." Then he said, "Jesus, remember me when you come into your kingdom." Jesus answered him, "Truly I tell you, today you will be with me in paradise." What an interesting choice of passages this week, right? It's an odd way to lead into the weeks coming up. And next week is for sure, verifiably, the start of Advent. We're preparing for Christ to enter into this world. We have a miraculous story of a birth and a life that will change the world. We have hope, peace, love, and joy just around the corner. It's the start of a brand new year in the church calendar. We have a wonderful beginning just 1 week away. And here we are reading about Jesus suffering while hanging on a cross. We're at the end of the story. As people today would say, maybe this is a spoiler alert. Imagine walking into a theater. You're going to just see this new movie about the life of Jesus. You've paid your $12 ticket, you've got your $10 popcorn and your $8 drink. You're just about to walk into the theater and someone walking out right before you says, "I can't believe they just hung him on a cross like that." There's no point in seeing that movie now, right? And that's basically what we're doing today. But sometimes starting at the end can be beneficial. Sometimes knowing the end can change how we perceive what happens along the way. Getting back to our Star Wars example, I think it's very much the case with the story of Anakin. Knowing his ending makes knowing what he did in life that much more poignant. Knowing where his life is leading causes those choices that he makes along the way to be that much more impactful. We can understand that later in life, when he's suffering, when he's in pain during his time as Darth Vader, we can understand what led him there. We can better imagine the pain that he's feeling. Perhaps it even makes that redemption at the end just a little bit more sweeter. And that's what we're facing today. We know we're the story, the greatest one ever told, and I'm not talking about Star Wars now, I've moved on. We know where that greatest story is headed. We know that this child whose birth we're about to celebrate, we know it ends on a cross. But we also know that we need the cross to appreciate the manger. And in all actuality, the manger and the cross, they don't quite mean as much without each other. In many ways, the message they convey is codependent. Yes, the manger in itself signifies a miracle. It symbolizes prophecy being fulfilled. The miracles that Jesus performed changed lives. His sermon made believers out of so many back then, and they continue to do the same today. But it's the cross that signifies that we have been washed clean. It's the cross that shows us the true depth of God's love for us. It's the cross that shows us what Jesus was willing to do for us. A manger on its own, well, other people have been born into lowly circumstances. Even kings have been born into poverty to rise above that. A cross on its own, well, others have been crucified. There were 2 others in our reading today. But together, the manger and the cross provide us a message of a king that came into the world as quietly as possible, and about the same king who laid down his life so that everyone else could truly live. It's also important to remember that God knew this ending from day one, before it even happened. All along, God knew that it had to end the way that it did. And still, he gave us that beautiful story of a manger outside of an inn that was too full. Still, he gave us a healer. Still, he gave us a Savior. When all along, he knew the ending would have to be the ultimate act of mercy. And Jesus, as he was here on earth, he also knew the ending to his story. But he continued healing. He continued teaching. He knew where it all would lead, but he did it anyway. He did it for you, and he did it for me. He did it for that other criminal on the cross who knew the punishment that he deserved. And now we have that road to paradise because he did it all anyway. When we start at the end of this story, when we look ahead to where it leads, I think we gain a deeper appreciation for the entire thing. We appreciate more what Jesus did through his life, knowing what he would have to do later. We appreciate more God sending him into this world, knowing the sacrifice that would have to come. Now, have you ever arrived at a point in your life where you had said, if only I had knew that all along? What if we had known in advance what would happen in the morning of September 11th, 2001? How many lives could we have saved if we just convinced them to stay home one day? What if we had known all along what would happen with World War II? Could we have stopped a Holocaust? If we would have known the ending to these things, I think we would have tried to stop it. But God knew the ending to the story of Jesus and still let it happen. Jesus knew the ending of his story and still he went to the cross. And knowing that makes it all that much more powerful. A friend of mine shared these words with me this week. They were written by Kimberly Henderson in 2017. I would have pulled Joseph out of that pit, out of that prison, out of that pain. I would have cheated nations out of the one that God would use to deliver them from famine. I would have pulled David out of Saul's spear-throwing presence, out of the caves he hid away in, out of the pain of rejection. I would have cheated Israel out of a God-hearted king. I would have pulled Esther out of being snatched from her only family, out of being placed in a position she never asked for, out of the path of a vicious, power-hungry foe. I would have cheated people out of the woman God would use to save their very lives. And I would have pulled Jesus off of the cross, off of the road that led to pain and suffering, off of the path that would mean nakedness and beatings, nails and thorns. I would have cheated the entire world out of a Savior, out of salvation, out of an eternity filled with no more suffering and no more pain. We can't see all the ends, but God does. Jesus did. And still we have the manger. Still we have the cross. Starting at the end of the story means that everything that was done before, it was worth it. We are loved enough to be saved, no matter the cost. But there's one final twist to this story. We've been talking a lot today about endings, but we know that with this reading with Jesus on Golgotha, it's not the end of the story. Even today, as we read these verses that feel like an ending, we know the story doesn't stop there. That story continues. It continues to this day. As we prepare for this coming season of Advent, that should be the message of purest hope that we could ever imagine. We begin this week by looking to the cross, an ending of sorts. But with that ending, next week, we travel back to the beginning. My prayer for us this year is that we remember that Advent isn't just about the manger. My prayer is that we remember that the manger and the cross go hand in hand. My prayer is that by starting here, at what appears to be the end, that the beginning feels all the more special in the weeks ahead. And all of God's people said,